2008 and 2009, the world started going populist in terms of the leaders they elected. Uh, I think people felt the need for strong men to lead the world. Uh, a hyper masculine response was needed. And you can see that right across the world. And they are the ones who have dealt with this pandemic in the worst possible way. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, Anil, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. This is I've been twice, to your literary festival in person. What a treat to be here with my teacher and friend, Larry Brilliant, and my best to all my friends in India and everyone else who's watching. Anil, before I answer that question, I really need to share with you the framework with which I'm looking at this pandemic, just as Larry did, and then I can answer the question you posed once you know how I'm looking at this more broadly. So the argument I've made from the very beginning is that to think clearly as a leader or as a citizen about this pandemic, you actually have to put yourself in the frame of natural systems. You have to look at the world through natural systems. That's actually not something most people do or have the knowledge to do. Most people look at the world through the framework of markets or traditional politics. But to understand this pandemic and to respond appropriately, you have to start from the perspective of natural systems. Fortunately, the first time I appeared at Lit Live, I was there to speak about a book I wrote about natural systems called Hot, Flat, and Crowded. And that's really the book I've relied on most in thinking through this problem. Now, whenever I explain to people, where I start, I like to tell them that on my daughter works for National Public Radio here, and on the Easter Sunday, NPR, National Public Radio, did a roundup of pastors' sermons from around America at the height of the pandemic. And my favorite was Pastor Michael Curry from the National Cathedral, who ended his Easter sermon by singing a little song. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. Well, Anil, just substitute she for he, and you'll understand where I start in thinking about this pandemic. This is the first time she, Mother Nature, she got the whole world in her hands. This is the first time for our generation of plants and animals, unless you were alive in 1918 or 103. This is the first time for our generation of Homo sapiens that we've actually faced all together, from Mumbai to Minneapolis, from Bethesda, to Bangalore, we've all at the same time faced what I call one of Mother Nature's fastballs. That's an American baseball term. I don't know what the cricket equivalent is. But fastballs are the things that Mother Nature throws at her species, plants and animals, to sort out who is the fittest, as Darwin taught us. Who shall get their DNA into the next generation? And these fastballs are called droughts and floods and hurricanes and tornadoes and wildfires and germs and viruses. And she throws them at us. Now, when she throws her fastballs at us, who does she reward? What does she reward? She does not reward the smartest. No. She does not reward the strongest. No. She rewards the most adaptive. That is the history of evolution. She rewards who can adapt to my problem. And what adaptation strategies does she actually reward? This is the crux of the matter. She basically asks her plant and animals 3 questions after she's thrown her fastball at them, her virus, her wildfire. The first thing she asks is something Larry alluded to. Are you humble? Are you humble? Do you respect my virus? Because if you don't, I will kill you. It will kill you or someone you love. Are you humble? The second thing she asks is, are you coordinated? Because again, as Larry alluded, she evolved her virus over millennia novel ones all the time, to find any crack in our individual or communal immune system. She says, are you coordinated? And lastly, she says, have you built your adaptation strategy on chemistry, biology, and physics? Because that's all I am. That's all I am, baby. I'm just chemistry, biology, and physics. And I'm Mother Nature, I'm going to do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And again, to use an American baseball term, maybe that applies to cricket, I always bat last. And I always bat 1,000. I've never lost a duel in 4.8 billion years with any of my species. So if you've built your adaptation strategy on chemistry, biology, and physics, i.e. on science, on masks, on lockdowns, on social distancing, you will do fine. If you've built your adaptation strategy on politics, ideology, and an election schedule, I will hurt you or someone you love. So if you look around the world today, just to close this point, when you face one of Mother Nature's fastballs, like a pandemic, a global pandemic, you need to simultaneously maximize two things at the same time. How do we save the most lives, but also the most livelihoods at the same time? Because you need both. If you just shut down everything and save lives, you'll create millions of deaths of despair over the long term. If you just save jobs, you will cause millions of short-term deaths in the near term. You need a strategy that maximally saves lives and livelihoods at the same time. Now, if you look around the world, you see three basic strategies. The first is the Chinese model that says we will use the tools of our surveillance state, tools we've developed actually to control our people, to try to control a virus, to trace, track, test, and quarantine people. And we'll do that as efficiently as we can to hold down the transmission numbers and wait for a vaccine to give us herd immunity. Second model is the Swedish model that says we're going to partly open, partly close. We're actually going to let our young and healthy people contract the disease, develop natural herd immunity, over time, and protect our most elderly. Sweden did a terrible job, by its own admission, of protecting its most elderly. Whether this strategy works in the long run, I think is TBD, to be determined. Then you have democratic versions of both those. India's is one of them. Then you have the American approach. The American approach was to talk like we were going to lock down like China, to actually act like we were going to herd immunity like Sweden, to prepare for neither and claim we're superior to both. That is the American strategy. It's kind of a what the hell. I'm kind of tired of this lockdown. I'm going to the bar or to a wedding or a party or whatever. It's been a terrible, as Larry can tell you from an expert point of view, a shameful performance. One of the worst things I've witnessed in my lifetime. But we did not respect Mother Nature. And we violated every one of her adaptation dictums, and we're paying for that by having the most cases in the world, 25% of all global cases, with only 4% of the global population.
Okay, Tom, I'll come back to you. Larry, in 2006, you gave a TED Talk, which was applauded all over the world, and you warned of a pandemic. We're now talking of something that you said 14 years ago. And I've seen that TED Talk, and you showed a diagram where about the spread, how quickly it spread right through the world. And then you said something that we should follow the Buddhist dictum of slowing down time. What did you... Larry?
Neil, I lost the last word that you said. It got clipped. Could you repeat that, please?
Okay, I said that in that talk, you had said that we should follow the Buddhist dictum of slowing down time. And I said, what did you mean by that?
Well, I think slowing down time when you are faced with an adversary allows you to go deep. and to understand what is happening around you, to really understand all the facets, to look with compassion, with metta, with love, and understand who's being hurt and how you can help. Always the bodhisattva vow of how can you help? How can you help the most people? I think that, as Tom said, if we were grading countries and giving them A's or B's or C's, we have some A's that we could give, maybe even an A plus or two. They tend to be islands run by women. New Zealand, Taiwan, Iceland. They would probably get the first batch of A's. There'd be some A minuses for South Korea. I would probably give Germany an A minus, another woman running a wonderful country. Further down the alphabet, we would come to the United States. And I don't think we have a letter low enough. Certainly an F for a failing grade. And I think I contrast the way the two programs that I worked in India, the polio eradication program, the smallpox eradication program, and of course the blindness program with the Aravind Eye Hospital in Madurai. These three programs slowed down time. They took appraisal of everything that was going on around them in the disease. They planned ahead. They made the best use of people, and they put them in the places that would do the most good. They did surveillance and then responded. First, they understood the science. We were able to eradicate smallpox. India eradicated polio and has not had a case in 4 years now. The blindness program in India has been a legendary success because of Aravind. The United States government did exactly the opposite in every one of these characteristics. We had preparation, we ignored it. In fact, the Trump administration fired the people who had been hired to do pandemic preparation. We threw away our leadership position in having test kits and having the greatest investment in medicine in the world. We had a profound, deep, wonderful public health system, envied all over the world. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, so venerated that China named their organization China CDC, and India named their organization India's CDC equivalent. And it has failed us because of a chronic lack of investment, demoralization, distraction, and depression, I think. So we would get a failing grade. And this is not like a copybook exercise where you get a do-over. We are dealing with lives. It is not too late. We have time to do it the right way. But now we can't do it unless we did it the way these great success stories I've told you about did it. We have to do it with all the world cooperating. The beauty of the Indian smallpox program is that out of a love for India, doctors came from almost 50 countries, and they were Hindus and Buddhists and Muslim and Jews and Christians and Jains, and they spoke every language you could imagine. They came to New Delhi, they worked together with love for India, and we eradicated smallpox. And the same thing followed with polio and with blindness. And we need that again today. We need to strengthen global cooperation. That is the only way we will get ourselves out of this fix that we are.
But in fact, Tom, what I see is the exact opposite, that we are getting more and more nationalistic. In fact, the Russians seem to be in the space race again. They're calling this thing Sputnik 5. Now, I want to come back to this question which I asked you earlier, which Larry has also elaborated on. Why is it that the women leaders have done better than the men leaders? And especially the tough guy men leaders?
Well, I don't know, and I don't want to engage in any wild gender-based speculation. In the case of Mrs. Merkel, let's just start with the fact that she's a physicist. She respects science. Donald Trump does not. Donald Trump worships markets. Donald Trump's only encounter with the natural world was building golf courses. And what he learned from that encounter was that he could actually dominate nature, because he was famous for building waterfalls on his golf courses. So he actually thought that he could dominate nature. But his whole reference point, Anil, is markets. Now, you may remember, because this was a very telling moment, maybe the most telling early on in the pandemic for how we got off course, was our stock market made the biggest one-day drop. I believe it was on a Thursday or Friday in very early March. I don't remember exactly. And it really rattled people after a Trump speech in which it was clear that he didn't know what he was doing. And the next day, Trump took some remedial action, and the market shot up and actually made its biggest one-day rise. And you know what Trump did, Anil? He actually took a screenshot of that one-day rise, and he emailed it to Fox News, to one of their evening business reporters. And that business reporter actually showed on his show Trump's graph of the stock market rising, because Trump had autographed it. He'd autographed it. Now, while those knuckleheads were taking a picture of the market going back up, Mother Nature was silently, invisibly, inexorably, exponentially, and mercilessly spreading COVID-19 around the country. And so I can't generalize why these women are doing better. To me, it's because they're good listeners. They don't think they know everything. They rely on science and on scientists, and they were ready. Trump is the worst combination of a complete ignoramus who won't delegate. Now, if you have a leader who's a complete ignoramus, but he delegates, you're going to do fine. If you have a leader who's really smart and doesn't delegate, you're probably going to do okay. But where you really get in trouble is when you have a leader who's a complete ignoramus who won't delegate and allow people with real knowledge to take over. In fact, he gets jealous when those people get more attention from the public. And that is the core of our problem. So I can't speak to the strength of these other countries, but I can tell you exactly why we're in trouble. We have a president who is a complete ignoramus, but will not delegate.
Yeah, well, that central point is right, that the countries which have done better have listened to the scientists, have listened to people with knowledge, and they've let them, the scientists and the epidemiologists, talk to the people instead of trying to hog the limelight themselves. Now, this brings us to this question.
Can I say one thing? Can I say one thing just about your point? You introduced my friend, Dr. Larry Brilliant. Larry's responsible for eliminating, a disease, a mini pandemic in one of the world's most populous countries. I'd say he's got a lot of experience. He's one of the first people I called. He'll tell you. I want to know from Larry, has the President of the United States, has anyone from our CDC called him?
Hey, have they called you?
A lot of people have called as individuals. I think you were. I think Tom is right that the science gives us a way to conquer this virus. This is a terrible virus. Make no mistake about it. It is a novel virus that every day we're finding out more and more about the pathophysiology, the way that it affects the body. It looked a little bit like a respiratory disease, but so does smallpox. And that was also a respiratory disease. But nobody would mistake it for the flu. But a drumbeat began saying, well, it's only the flu. It is not the flu. It affects your heart. It affects your brain. It affects your circulatory system, your liver. It is a horrible way to be sick. Uh, the drumbeat began that children don't get sick, and if they get sick, they don't get very sick. 1/3 of all children who are admitted to hospital wind up in the ICU. Of course, it affects children, and of course, children spread it. So many of the legends or the memes that come about in regard to a new disease, and this is not the case just in the United States, and it is not the case just for COVID. If you look throughout history, all pandemics create chaos. All pandemics reorder the global order. Many pandemics reordered boundaries and created new countries and toppled regimes and put in new political ideas, new religious ideas. This is what happens with a pandemic. The world is seized with one idea, 8 billion people thinking every day pretty much about the same thing. So what is happening now should be seen in the context of the past and, Anil, in the context of the future, because we live in an age of pandemics. 20 years ago, we were all bragging that we had exited the world of infectious diseases. It was a thing of the past. It was a thing of poverty and, not of modernity. But now, because human beings are encroaching on animal territory, we are living in the same world ecosystem as monkeys and bats, that we are sharing everything, including viruses. And every year, 2 or 3 viruses like COVID spill over, jump from animals to humans. We've had 30 of them in the past 30 years. You know their names. We'll start with one in India, chikungunya, and dengue, and West Nile, and Ebola, and Marburg, and bird flu, and swine flu. I could go on for quite a while. But we have another batch coming because we cut down the rainforest, we cut down the jungles, we move in with suburbs. As long as we do that, we will, as Tom said, we will help Mother Nature to get even with us by spreading new viruses amongst us. We have to change the way we live to protect against this future onslaught of viruses while we're simultaneously getting rid of this one. And Anil, we can get rid of this. We have to strengthen the World Health Organization. We have to strengthen the organs of global cooperation. We have to bury enmity and work together. Albert Einstein once said, you cannot solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that it was created. You have to go to a higher level of consciousness. It's true also for politics. No amount of nationalism can stop a global pandemic. We have to find new ways to work together. And then we have to see which countries have shown us the way. We have to see where were the best practices. We've already got more than enough good practices for India to follow, for the United States to follow. And we need to do it because I'm worried very much about India. I'm worried about India now. If there were a race to the bottom, a race to the highest number of cases, India is now, as Hans Rosling would have said had he been here with us, India is now coming up the chart in cases and deaths and is now number 3 or 4 in the world. And it will soon become the repository of the most virus in the world. So the world's got to be aware of this, and we need to work together to help those countries that need it the most. That's going to be even more true when we have a vaccine. And we have to decide what's the equitable distribution, the science, what's the non-political way to distribute this vaccine to help us to stop the epidemic as fast as we can. And we can do it. We shouldn't be disheartened. We act together. We need to do it.
Yeah. Now, what we've seen is that political leadership has failed in many, many countries. And I think that's what we've been talking about. Now, is there any way that in future we can insulate fights against pandemics against the political leadership. See, this time WHO has failed miserably to play its role. But is it at all possible to insulate health from political leadership? Because you can't leave a country to one man or one cabinet for people to die in the hundreds just because they are being foolish and taking the wrong decisions. Whereas the scientists would know what to do. Someone like Larry would know what to do. So, what do we do in future to prevent all this? Tom, you go, please. Tom?
Well, my answer, Anil, as an American right now, is to vote for Joe Biden, raise money for Joe Biden, caucus for Joe Biden, drive someone to the polls to vote for Joe Biden, because this is all about power. Our president is a deeply disturbed human being. And when the president of the United States, with all its scaling power, is a deeply disturbed and dishonest man, that affects the whole world. I don't say that out of any jingoism. It's just a fact. America's approach to crises historically, global crises, was three things. First of all, we always tried to be the leader that coordinated the response, the global response. Second, we gave aid and comfort.
I don't want this discussion about Trump. I want to look at the future. As Larry was saying, if we are a global village now, especially when it comes to pandemics, how do we insulate people's health from political leadership? Is there any possible way to do that?
No, there's no possible way to do that. That's why I'm starting with Trump. If you don't have a leader who respects science, you're not going to isolate the population from a pandemic. It's that simple. And if you don't have an American leader,
Larry, what do you say?
Well, I mean, we can always put the public back in public health and do things that devolve responsibility for health. In India, health is a state subject. Also in the United States, much of health is a state subject. Our governors, your chief ministers, really are responsible for most of health services. So you find very big differences between states based on the competence and the wealth of the different states. It's one thing to say, can you separate the response to heart disease or diabetes from political leadership at the national level? And I think to some extent you can. You will see states that have done a better job or a worse job. But what Tom says is absolutely right. When you put the word pan into the equation, which means all, when you have a global effort, then you can't separate it from politics, because it's politics that controls the levers of power, decides the priorities, decides the resource allocation, decides the people who run it and the theories that they follow. If you are following a nationalistic theory, if you believe in the righteousness of nationalism, it's a very exclusionary ideology. We need an inclusionary ideology to solve a problem at a global level like a pandemic. Look, if we are successful, if half of the 220 member states of WHO are successful, that will leave us with 110 unsuccessful countries that still have the virus. And it will ping pong back and forth. It will, I don't know if you know this game, whack-a-mole, where you whack a mole. It will go back and forth like ping ponging in a hopscotch way. India won't be safe until Pakistan and Bangladesh are safe. The United States won't be safe until Latin America and Africa are safe. It is really an interesting and a moral call to action. If this does not bring us together as a world and help us put aside our differences to work together, what will do it? Maybe an invasion of an alien. I would say this is an invasion of an alien. This is an alien life form, COVID. We have been invaded. And will we respond to that call? I hope so. I see signs of it, but time is getting short.
Okay, now there is a very strong feeling in the US, amplified by Mr. Trump, but there's also a feeling in India that China is responsible for this particular pandemic and it should be punished. Now, is that something, is that a thought we should hold, or is it a thought we should discard?
In 1974, 1975, India had the sad ownership of 80% of all the smallpox in the world and was responsible for a period of time for 100% of the smallpox cases exported to the rest of the world. No, of course we shouldn't hold India responsible for that. India was just the last place that we came in a process of doing a global campaign to eradicate smallpox. Pakistan is the last place in the world now with polio. Do we blame Pakistan? No, we help Pakistan because it is in our interest to help get rid of a disease that could travel all over the world. This is not the China virus, nor was the Spanish flu Spanish. It is an old way of dismissing and denigrating countries to name bad diseases after them. It's not fair. By the way, the Russians named the worst strain of smallpox India 1. That wasn't an Indian problem. That was a Russian problem. We need to get rid of that idea. Yes, this virus began in China. So did the original SARS. Why is that? Because it began in bats, and human beings are now moving into the forests where bats live, and the normal terrain of bats are being cut down. If we want to deal with this and deal with it now and in the future, we have to see it as a global problem and get rid of the petty squabbling and name calling. And certainly this is not to blame China or fight with China. We need to figure out how to make it not happen again in China or any other place.
Yeah, but Tom, now Larry is saying we should help China, but China is such a closed society and they will not admit to wanting help. How do you overcome that?
Well, I agree with everything Larry said. I would just add that there's only one thing China owes itself, and therefore the rest of us. It owes its own citizens a complete accounting of exactly how this zoonotic virus jumped from bats or primates, whatever it was, to human beings, how it happened, when and where, so all of us can prevent it, and first and foremost, China can prevent it. Now, SARS in 2002, as Larry said, SARS-CoV-1 actually manifested in Guangzhou, and it was also a zoonotic disease. After that happened, China vowed to close the wet markets where these kind of zoonotic transmissions were happening. It actually didn't do that. So, we need to ask China nothing more and nothing less than what it's doing to protect people. Because whatever it's doing to protect its own people in a world that is now so fast and fused is going to benefit or not the rest of us. So my only call to China is, do not think you can lead the world by exporting masks when you are masking still how, where, when SARS-CoV-2 emerged. That's my one demand of them. And I think that's a demand that's in line with the interests of the Chinese people.
May I make a comment about that, Anil? Because if our Chinese brothers and sisters are listening to this, there's an old aphorism: if you're not guilty, don't behave like a guilty person. And I would say, if China is forbidding Chinese researchers to publish the science of where this virus began, it looks suspicious. If China is forbidding any research to come from outside, WHO and other countries, to help understand what kind of a bat, what kind of an event caused that spillover, it looks suspicious. I don't believe the conspiracy theories that this was a bioweapon. The virus shows no trace of being a humanly engineered weapon. Mother Nature did a good enough job of engineering this virus. But it is a concern that there may have been a bat that was infected that wasn't the first animal, that there may have been disease a month earlier and other animals may have had that. If that's the case, maybe we could find that animal, and that would help us understand the mysteries of this virus, and it would help humanity. And in withholding that, China is doing itself and the rest of the world a disservice.
Yeah. Now, is it at all a possibility that we could have bioterrorism? There were a lot of conspiracy theories going around right in the beginning of this pandemic that this was started deliberately by China, which of course no one believes now. But that leads us to the possibility that perhaps in future, a terrorist group, perhaps, or a country which wants to wage war against the rest of the world might use something like this. Is that a possibility, and can it be prevented?
I actually think it's an inevitability. And I say that just by looking at history. When I worked in the smallpox program, which was in the 70s and 80s, and when I went home, I went back to the United States, and I brought back with me murtis of Ram and Hanuman and Shiva. And I was so proud of the souvenirs I had taken back. Many of my Russian colleagues took back souvenirs of scabs of Indian patients who had smallpox. And then they took it to a place called the Biopreparat Lab, and they tried to find the most potent smallpox virus, and they tried to pair it in an unholy mixture with Ebola, and to create a virus that was half smallpox, half Ebola. We call it a chimera, after the Greek name for an ancient mythological monster. They were not successful in making those two viruses work together, but many Russians were killed in the process. And many of the people, the doctors who worked in that, came to the West, testified in Congress, wrote books. It's not a secret anymore. But that was an act of bioterrorism, attempted bioterrorism. But it wasn't just Russia. The United States had anthrax. Many different countries had their special bug that they would work on and try to create bioterrorism. What's different is that with technology moving as fast as it is, a high school student or certainly a junior college student right now in their lab could create a virus out of a whim or an experience, an idea that could in fact become a lethal weapon, either intentionally or accidentally, that could be let loose in the world. We need to invest more in understanding how that might happen. We need to cooperate globally to make sure that we have early warning of anything that might be like that. This is not a game, and it is certainly not something to get momentary political advantage. We have treaties, global treaties, anti-bioterrorism treaties, but I think in this age of nationalism, those treaties are being weakened and splintered. They need to be resurrected and strengthened.
Okay, Tom, there's talk of immunity passports. You heard of that, right? Immunity passports.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that's ethical, or is it going to be one form of discrimination?
Well, I'm not sure it's either. I think it's inevitable that countries are going to want to know before they open up your status vis-a-vis COVID-19. I think that's inevitable. But let me try to answer that question and pick up with something Larry said in answer to your previous question. It's really about globalization and why we're having so many pandemics now. I recently looked back at what I've been covering for the last 20 years, Anil, and I realized that pandemics are us. Actually, all I've been covering, the biggest stories I've covered over the last 20 years were all pandemics. The first was a geopolitical pandemic. It was called 9/11. Second was a financial pandemic. It was called 2008. Third was a biological pandemic. It was called COVID-19. And the fourth is an atmospheric pandemic. It's called climate change. So actually, all I've been doing for the last 20 years is covering the impact and fallout of pandemics. So why is that? Why is that? Well, you'll notice also, with all four of these pandemics, they came with a warning heart attack and then the full coronary. So in 1993, a guy named Ramzi Youssef tried to blow up the World Trade Center. Under building number 2, the bomb didn't go off sufficiently. That was the warning heart attack of a jihadist Islamist attack. And in 9/11, we got the full coronary. In 1997, a hedge fund, 1998, called Long-Term Capital Management, amassed $1 trillion in leverage and almost blew up Wall Street. It was only emergency action by our central bank and all the banks on Wall Street that prevented that warning heart attack. In 2008, we got the full coronary. In 2002, something called SARS-CoV-1 emerged in Guangzhou, China. A doctor traveled from there to Hong Kong, stayed in a hotel in room 911. Can't make that up. But we managed to stem that warning heart attack. But in 2019, we got the full coronary. And right now, we're getting multiple warning heart attacks about climate change. So why is this? Why are pandemics becoming us? Well, the reason is, first of all, globalization, as Larry alluded to. We've now wired more nodes of the world together and then grease the connection between those nodes to make the transmission faster and faster. You know, Anil, that between December 2019 and March 2020, there were 3,200 direct flights from China to the United States. 3,200. There were 50 direct flights from Wuhan to the United States. From Wuhan. Most Americans had never heard of Wuhan. 50 direct flights. So we've connected more nodes in the world together faster than ever. Secondly, and Larry has also been alluding to this, we removed the buffers, all the things that slowed down those connections to actually manage the flow of this system. So we, in the Arab Muslim world, they actually removed cultural buffers. What was bin Laden about? It was about purging the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East of different cultures. Well, cultures, diversity in nature and in the human world are buffers, okay? Polycultures are naturally more resilient than monocultures, because monocultures in agriculture are enormously susceptible to a single disease. And monocultures in politics are enormously susceptible to diseased ideas, okay? So the Arab Muslim world had purged a lot of its diversity in the Arabian Peninsula, and out of it came that bin Laden idea. We removed the buffers in finance. All regulatory buffers we had in finance, we began to remove them in the name of efficiency, efficiency of capital, efficiency of supply chains. We removed the buffers, as Larry's been talking about, between us and the natural world. We invaded natural ecosystems. We killed the apex predators. We left behind the generalized species, as Larry said, of bats, rats, and primates that had co-evolved in the wilderness with these viruses. Then we removed them, put them in wet markets, and they jumped into humans that had not co-evolved with these, and we see the result. And lastly, we're removing the natural buffers to climate change, whether it's sea ice or whether it's mangroves that buffer storms. And the thing with climate change is there is no herd immunity to climate change. There's only an endless pounding on the herd. And climate change also doesn't peak like a virus. But the great thing about climate change is we already know the cure. We already know the cure, which is lowering our CO2 emissions. So if you look at what's happening around the world, we've been wiring the world together faster, farther, deeper, cheaper than ever before. We've been removing the buffers, and then humans do all the crazy stuff they always did. But now that craziness gets transmitted from one little node in the system to the whole system farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. And therefore, pandemics are us. And therefore, to conclude the point Larry made, without cooperation, without coordination, the notion that America first or India first or China first is going to make you safe is stuff and nonsense. The world needs to be more coordinated than ever before.
Well, what both of you are talking about, I think, is so fundamental because you're talking of huge cultural transformations. You are, in fact, in a way, talking of changing human nature the way it has developed. And I see both of these as impossibilities. So, really, I think we are stuck with pandemics forever and ever.
No, I don't think so. I think that what is basic in human nature is self-preservation. You are identifying a selfishness gene as something which is part of the way we have survived. We all still, every once in a while, see out of the corner of our eye something that's not there. We have some genes that harken all the way back to saber-toothed tigers or whatever animal was there in our ancestors' life. And we have a lot of these self-preservation genes. I would argue that is the way out. It is that very same self-preservation gene. The problem is we're not good at long-term thinking. We're not good at understanding an event that happened in that part of the world that caused an event in this part of the world. We haven't evolved enough in our frontal cortex to make network kind of connections. We can keep that selfishness gene, but merely add to it an understanding of the linkage, not just the butterfly effect, that when a butterfly dies in Indonesia, it affects the stock market in New York. But certainly when a rainforest is cut down in Indonesia, it does affect the viral genome that could affect New York in a very different and darker way. But we need to train our children. We need to increase the quality of our dialogue to understand long-term effects, distant effects, and then that selfishness gene actually might make us more multipolar. It may make us deal better with our global natures because it is in our individual best interest that the collective good be maintained. It's difficult to see. It's not as straightforward as microeconomics, but it's critically important. And we haven't communicating that as we will need to now.
Right. I'm going to throw it open now to the audience for questions. And they're already coming in. Here's one from Sumana. It says, did the Global Public Health Information Network, did it help in early detection? Or could it help in early detection in future? A global public health information system.
In fact, I believe they're talking about the original Global Public Health Information Network from Ottawa in Canada. And the person who's writing that is very aware of the history of SARS. This is SARS-2, but SARS-1, which arose in Canada, in China, it spread to Canada. And the Canadians were very sensitized to early detection. In fact, that SARS outbreak in 2004, 2005, that outbreak was detected in Canada because they were using a digital disease detection system that was able to scrub the news flow that occurred in Mandarin and translate it. So they saw the disease SARS 6 months before the Chinese government reported it. China in those days was guilty of hiding that disease. They didn't want to appear like a backward country with an infectious disease. After that happened, because that disease caused such havoc, the Chinese government really seemed to change, and for years opened up, was the earliest of all the countries to report many communicable diseases, swine flu, bird flu. It's a challenge right now with COVID, but your questioner is absolutely right. Early disease detection systems have made it possible for us to find COVID even earlier. It would have been worse if we had done as we did with Ebola, where we gave Ebola a 6-month head start. A virus which multiplies exponentially is not something you want to give a 6-month head start to. So these early warning systems are critical, but unfortunately, they are not enough. They're a necessary but not sufficient condition to conquering this virus.
Okay, here's a question to Tom from R. Gurudat. Hasn't the pandemic exposed lack of access to public health for populations worldwide?
No question. Warren Buffett famously said in the financial pandemic, when the tide goes out, you see who isn't wearing a bathing suit. And it turns out that we in America and a lot of other countries had so underinvested in public health. We weren't wearing bathing suits when we needed to draw on a public health infrastructure to distribute testing, to coordinate testing and tracing, and ultimately to provide vaccination. And we had in America, I can only speak of, I'm not familiar with other countries. Larry will be much better on that. But we had systematically and chronically invested in public health. And as Larry said, President Trump even dismissed the White House pandemic experts. We threw away our umbrella right on the eve of the rainstorm.
Larry, the question from Rajalakshmi Apparao for you. Because with your experience of India, what do you think we should be doing with a population of 1.3 billion to protect ourselves in future?
Well, first of all, I love India. Every 1.3 billion in India and every corner of it and every community in it. It's hum to pakka Hindustani. I mean, really, it's my heart. So India has so many advantages because of the things that we do culturally. It's some things that in India we sort of take for granted. We do namaste and we don't shake hands. I have often wondered if that perhaps was the result of some ancient pandemic that came through India, and the wise men and women of the time said, no, we're not going to touch each other quite as much because it will spread disease. But India has an advantage when you are not shaking hands. India has an advantage when we have such strong family ties that we stay together, and it's easier in a way to stay with your family and self-isolate in multi-generational houses. It can be a plus and a minus. But what I think we do with India is radical transparency. India has been guilty in the past of suppressing cases, of underplaying the amount of cases. That was certainly true in smallpox. It's true in COVID. It is not unique to India. Advice to my Indian brothers and sisters is don't do it. We need to know where the disease is so we know how to allocate resources and what to do. And sometimes the cooperation between the states, especially at the borders, hasn't been as good as it should be. There's a lot of this. It's your fault. It came from your district, and it came from Gwalior, and Jaipur didn't like it, or whatever it was. And you need to have national leadership that is science-based, and listen to your NICD, listen to your ICMR. India has some of the greatest medical and public health institutions in the world. And remember all the heroes of the polio program, the blindness program, the smallpox program, the conquest of chikungunya. India has some legendary success stories. Celebrate them and bring public health back into fashion, because you're going to need it in the next several years as we continue to fight with COVID.
Question for you from Rajni Iyer. In the absence of informed and focused leadership, how do newspapers, news channels deal with the false information that's going out? You're a newspaper man, you've been a columnist for so many years. So How do we deal with this? There's another pandemic, which is fake news. Is there any way we can deal with that?
Well, Anil, it's a very good question because we haven't had just a pandemic. We've had a pandemic in the context of an infodemic. The ability of the internet to transmit lies, falsehoods, as fast as truth. And we live in a world of social networks whose business model is to get you agitated. And sometimes the things that, and to connect you with things that agitate and stimulate you the most. And we know from scientific studies that actually lies get people more agitated than the truth. So we need to understand, Anil, that the internet is actually an open sewer of untreated, unfiltered information. Oh my God, it's full of rubies and diamonds and gold and silver. We know that, deep knowledge. It's also full of cut glass, rusty cans, and toxic materials. And we need a whole new way of educating our children. I call it digital civics, that from kindergarten, children need to be educated on how to sift out the gold and diamonds and rubies in this global information system from the toxic materials, cut glass and rusty tin cans, because they're going to not be getting their news as my generation did when we were younger, from the BBC, from three networks, from the Times of India, platforms and systems that basically valued the truth and corrected mistakes. And so as we shift from one information system to another, the only solution is to, when the buffers are no longer built into those systems, for the most part, they're still there with the New York Times, I believe, and they're still there with certain newspapers and networks, but they're not there with Facebook and Twitter. When the buffers aren't built into the system, then you've got to install the buffers inside of every user. You've got to basically teach digital civics how to read information, how to cross-check information, so no one ever says to you, but Anil, I read it on the internet, as if that should be settling the bar bet. So this is a huge education problem we have. Mark Zuckerberg is never going to hire enough editors to make Facebook a trusted platform, as far as I'm concerned. So it's a big, big challenge.
Okay. Larry, it's a question from Jay Talwar. How come China has contained the virus and the rest of the world has not?
Well, China has not contained the virus. China contained the Wuhan outbreak and did it with a combination of an adroit response and a level of draconian measures that India or the United States would not be able to do. We will not go into a housing complex and nail a door shut. And we don't have the ability to bring doctors from the rest of the, a billion people and put them all in one small area like Wuhan, because the outbreak is too far advanced from now. China is constantly getting reinfections, importations from neighbors. Every once in a while, China will cut off travel. They will bring people back from Wuhan and now take them to Beijing when there's an outbreak there. China will not be able to continue to stay free of COVID until the rest of the world is, unless China wants to cut off all commerce, all travel, all communications with the rest of the world, which China doesn't want to do and its economy can't permit. So China is just as vulnerable as the rest of the world is, but they've gotten better at early detection and early response. That's a lesson we should learn. We should learn the best practices from each of the countries that have been successful and adapt them to our own culture and our own political system. There's a lot to learn from China, both ways, a lot to do and a lot to not do as a lesson from China.
Right. Tom, from Praveen Parekh, do you think the economic toll caused by the pandemic is going to cause social unrest in many countries? I think that's a very, very important question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I do. And you know, look at Lebanon today. It's just a mini example of a state that was already frail before the pandemic, and now has been economically devastated. Think about Libya, no real government. Syria, no real government. Yemen, no real government. Lebanon, just hanging on. So I think these weakest of weak states, you're going to see real social breakdown. And I don't even know what it looks like. Lebanon's already moved to a barter system in terms of the Lebanese economy. People just barter. You know, I've got eggs and you've got tennis shoes, and I'm going to barter my eggs for your tennis shoes because the currency is so depreciated. I worry about what the effect is on the United States when we have multiple $trillion bailouts, which we have to do because people are just out of work. 40 million Americans, we've got to get them money. But what are the long-term impacts of that on our currency, our status as the reserve currency nation? I think we haven't even begun to understand the long-term fallout of this devastation. And I think that we already, had a world of many frail states, and I think you could get some real social breakdown and large numbers of people moving from regions of disorder trying to get into the world of order. And so this is a time for the countries that can maintain order to really get together and try to work the countries of disorder get back on their feet.
Yeah. Do you think that, Tom, is that a possibility that the countries will work together?
It certainly isn't. Again, I'm going to go back. I'm not here to harp on Donald Trump. It's just I go back to what I was saying before, and if you look at previous global crises, America always played three roles. We were the coordinator of the coalition to stem that crisis. We were the provider of aid and comfort to those worst affected by that crisis. And we were the provider of the scientific solutions to stem that crisis and reverse it. We're not playing either of those roles. We have not tried to be the coordinator of anything, just the opposite. We've tried to undercut the lead coordinator of the World Health Organization by quitting. We have not been a source of scientific information, and we have not been a source of aid and comfort to anyone, not even ourselves. And I'm a big believer that America does occupy, for better and for worse, an outsized role in global politics. And when we get so off the rails, that really affects the whole system. Because China can talk about leading and not lead. China's not going to lead the world. No one's going to follow China voluntarily, except the vassal states around it. It does not have the moral authority to do that right now. I hope one day its moral authority will expand by things it does for others. But right now, that when America doesn't lead, nobody leads, and you have the kind of global vacuum you have right now.
Can the United Nations play a role?
No, the United Nations is only as strong as its key players, and if its key players don't want to play nice with each other, the United Nations doesn't exist in an alternative universe where it can be coordinated when the key powers that make up that institution want to be uncoordinated.
Okay. Larry, here's a question from you from Raksha Patil. How much can we trust vaccines that are fast-tracked, which is happening now? All vaccines are being fast-tracked. Forget the Russian one, which seems to be ridiculously fast-tracked. But what about the others?
Well, I think people are looking at the Russian vaccine that was tried on 38 people, one of whom was Putin's daughter, apparently, and said that's too small a sample to know whether it is safe. But is 3,000 a large enough sample? Is 30,000 a large enough sample where 10,000 are controls and 10,000 get a moderate dose and 10,000 get a high dose? We are looking for a vaccine that will help us stop the worst pandemic in our lifetimes, perhaps the worst pandemic in 10 generations. So, of course, we want to get one as fast as possible. And the first few vaccines that we get are unlikely to be good enough to be the global vaccines that we need. Let me just mention some of the attributes that we need to have in a vaccine that will work in the villages of India or in the cities of China, for that matter. It needs to be a vaccine that is stable, that is safe, that is inexpensive, but it also needs to be a vaccine that only requires one dose, not two doses, and certainly not seasonal boosters. It needs to be a vaccine that does not depend upon a cold chain. All the mRNA vaccines, for example, have to be kept at minus 80 degrees. Can you imagine the tens of thousands of jeeps that we'll need to go all over the world being able to carry a vaccine that has to be kept at minus 80 degrees? So we need to understand that there will be side effects that will only be found after 100,000 or 1 million or 10 million people have had the vaccine. I mentioned polio for a second because the polio vaccine trials took 5 million children before we adjudicated it as safe. Smallpox vaccine took 200 years of use. So we have a little bit ahead of ourselves. But I also want to mention one more thing for your listeners and your viewers. And I ask you the question, do you know which country has the greatest capacity to make the most vaccine in the world? And I'll that, but it might surprise you that it's India. In fact, it's one country, the Serum Institute in Pune, where perhaps as many as 60% of the world's children receive their vaccine from this one company in India. I'm hopeful that that company can play a role in stabilizing vaccine production, but also in adding something to the ethical and moral imperative of the use of a vaccine. I was very encouraged to hear a press release that 50% of the vaccines that will be made in Pune will be used for Indians, and I like that. And I also like that 50% would be shared with the rest of the world. I like that people are now thinking in advance of what they will do, because once there are vaccines, there will be vaccine fights. And I hope, while we see vaccine nationalism right now, as both Xi and Putin and Trump are competing to see who will get the first vaccine, I'd like them to compete with who can help get the most good vaccine in the arms of the most people in the world, not the narrow victory, but the long-term victory.
Here's a question to both of you from MP Ladd. That we know that WHO has really not been very effective this time. It's lost a lot of credibility. Is there any way of strengthening it? Because the role it played in, for example, the smallpox eradication was exemplary. But this time it seems to have been dithering. Now, first of all, why has that happened? And secondly, how can that be corrected? Tom, you want to go?
Yeah, I think Larry would have more insight into that. And Neil, I would again simply say the WHO is really only as strong as its constituent members. And if the key players in the WHO do not want to play nicely together, they won't do it outside the WHO or inside the WHO. So it really goes back to Larry's broader point that without marrying the selfish gene to globalization, to understanding that what happens in distant places affects all of us, and therefore we need to be coordinated at a wholly different level. We're really going to have a problem, and so that's really what I would say.
I would add to that of course I worked for WHO for 10 years, and anybody who's worked for WHO for a long time has a bit of a love-hate relationship with it. The love is how good the people are, how dedicated they are. If there's hate, it's that WHO is just structured terribly. Depending on a regional structure where all the power is in the regions, and the headquarters is unable to really get the resources to implement global programs. And you have, if you were starting a company today, Tom, I don't think you would put on your board of directors all your customers, all your creditors, all your enemies, and put them all on your board of directors. And that's the way WHO is set up. So WHO does need restructuring. But we are really fortunate because the leadership of WHO in this difficult era is good, is excellent. Tedros is the best director general that I've worked with of the last 7. Maybe Gro Brundtland might be a good competitor for that role. She was fantastic. But Tedros is a great director general. They have a wonderful organization called GORN. And I mention that because that is what you think of when you think of WHO right now, the Global Outbreak Response Network, which is run by Mike Ryan, a phenomenal epidemiologist. Great people at WHO, great leadership, terrible structure, and always beholden to the money that comes in. WHO's annual budget, just to give you an example, is smaller than the annual budget of the health department of the city of San Francisco. WHO's budget for 220 countries is less than the budget of a large American city. And it is it's impossible to carry out the tasks that WHO has been assigned with a budget like that. So we need to do something. We need to restructure it. You've seen over the years that the Global Fund, the UNAID program, Gavi, IAVI, all these satellites have been created, and WHO is supposed to be the sun around all these organizations' work, but it's not well funded, it's not supported, and it can only do what, as Tom said, its shareholders help it to do.
Well, I think we're running out of time, and I'd like both of you to give your closing remarks. Tom, would you start?
Well, I think it comes back to the point that Larry was making about the selfish gene. And people who don't know what world they're living in, and people who don't think about the future, tend not to do well there. We're living in a world that is more tightly bound together than ever before, that will transmit farther, faster, deeper, and cheaper aberrant behavior and positive behavior and new ideas from anywhere to anywhere. And we've never needed, in the face of this global pandemic and all the others that we've been through and will likely face, a world that is more coordinated, less nationalistic, and more science-based and more forward-looking than ever before. And that's what this pandemic is teaching us and warning us. And I hope we heed that warning. I hope, I can only speak for my own country, but I desperately hope we get a different administration that is open to working with other countries, not only to face these challenges, but to exploit the amazing opportunities that technology is giving us. So that's my hope. I hope India will be part of that. And I can't imagine us succeeding without it. Great to be with you at Lit Live virtually. Look forward to coming back in the future again for the third time in person.
I look forward to that. Larry, your closing remarks?
I'd like to agree with my friend Tom in what he has said, including the thanks, Anil, for inviting me to come virtually. I don't know about virtuously, but virtually to participate in this. After the Second World War, when the world was in chaos, and we watched the mushroom clouds from the atomic explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the firebombing of Dresden, and we saw the skeletons come out of the fire pits and the gas chambers of Auschwitz. The world shuddered in horror at what we had done, what we had built, what we had allowed to happen. And something happened that was magical. Each country gave up a little bit of its sovereignty to make the World Health Organization, the UN General Assembly, the FAO, this kind of alphabet soup of acronyms that creates the structure that has kept us together for 75 years. And we enjoyed that structure because we gave up a little bit of our sovereignty to be part of a greater whole. Now, maybe that structure is getting, as we say in America, a little long in the tooth. Maybe it's not right or fit exactly for purpose in the 21st century. But we can't destroy it without finding a replacement for it. We need to improve it and not abandon it. And what has happened with the forces of nationalism that have infested, I would say, taken over the countries that we all know and love so much, is these forces of nationalism, they pull us apart. They are centrifugal forces. If after the Second World War, the creation of the United Nations was a centripetal force bringing us together, these nationalistic forces are centrifugal forces. We cannot deal with a pandemic, any of the pandemics that Tom mentioned, the climate change pandemic, the pandemic of selfishness and ego, Kam, Krodh, Lobh, Moha. We can't deal with any of these pandemics unless we look at it as we are a whole population. 99.5% of our genome is the same, whatever the skin color or religion that we have. We are really all in this together. And that's not some kind of a hippie kumbaya silly statement. We are all in this together, and we will learn from this pandemic what happens when we think for a moment that we are alone and not in all this together, because you can't stop a global problem with a nationalistic theory. So I hope that my friends in India will take a good look at the problem that we have. India has a big problem ahead with COVID and a bigger opportunity to be a global leader in vaccine production, in finding best practices, in publishing ideas, in jumping right into WHO and helping to strengthen it and strengthen the World Council of Nations as we struggle to find an ending for this pandemic and a way to deal with, as Tom said, the next pandemic of climate change. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Larry Brilliant. Thank you, Thomas Friedman, for a very enlightening conversation. And I hope our listeners will learn a lot from what you've just said and will carry a glimmer of hope in these dark times. I think that is very important. And thank you, Sangeeta Jindal and the JSW team for making this possible. Now, tomorrow at the same time, 6:30, we have a second session, how culture and spirituality can restore our faith in humanity. And we have three very eminent people, Shobha De, Prasud Doshi, and Amish Tripathi. So we'll see you there tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Bye-bye.